My really good friend, Anthony Guthrie, he helped made this possible with a substantial donation. And thank you, my friend. Here are his questions. What do we know about the historical practice of slavery in the first century, especially the inheritance of foreign slaves who could be beaten to an extent without recourse? And I want to follow through with all that he has to say on this because you'll get the tone of what he's trying to ask. Yahweh, the author of the Epistle of James, and Jesus in the Gospels all seem to intend for the old laws to be upheld forever, including those regarding slavery. When Jesus states in Matthew 5 that he came to fulfill the law and the prophets, how was this used to justify the transatlantic slave trade? And does it seem that the character of Jesus ever really envisioned a world without slavery? So he has, just like some of the guys I've been interviewing, the scholars, they point out that what slavery was actual slavery. A lot of fundamentalist Christians make it, oh, it's only indentured servitude, and they don't realize the cruelty in the Hebrew Bible or even in the ancient Near East. Was Jesus upholding the same concepts of slavery? First question, I guess.
It's a complicated question. It turns out not to be an easy one. And one of the reasons it's complicated is because slavery was a major institution throughout antiquity that virtually nobody questioned per se. It wasn't seen as an ethical issue throughout in the Roman Empire. The other reason it's complicated is because it wasn't like American slavery. American slavery had everything to do with race, and ancient slavery had nothing to do with race. And it's true that foreign slaves could be beaten without penalty, but any slave could be beaten without penalty. A slave was the property of their owner. These were not indentured servants. The word in Greek for slave that gets used in the New Testament is doulos. It's the word that Paul uses of himself, that he's a doulos of Christ. He's the slave of Christ, meaning Christ is his owner, and Christ can do anything he wants with him. Even though that was the case, slavery was a very complicated institution in antiquity because there were slaves on numerous levels. You had some slaves who were sent to the salt mines. Their life expectancy would be about 2 years or something. It was very bad, very bad, very bad. But there were other slaves who were welcome members of upper elite households who were highly educated scholars or highly educated businessmen and businesswomen, and who were well placed and well treated and well dressed and well fed. And so it's not like there was a thing, slavery. There's this wide range of things. But it always involved somebody belonging to someone else, not as an indentured servant, but actually being being owned by them for whatever purpose they wanted to use them for. A large percentage of the population, I forget what the numbers are, but like a third of the population in Rome were slaves. It wasn't based on race. A lot of people, there were various ways to become enslaved. If you were born into slavery, you yourself were, in other words, your parents were both slaves and you were born as a slave. A lot of slaves were provided by wars. And so prisoners of war would typically be made slaves. You could be sold into slavery if you owed debt you weren't able to pay. You could be you were your own collateral. You could become a slave. So there are all sorts of ways to becoming slaves. But again, it wasn't based on race, or it was based on factors like that, the ones I've just mentioned.
And I guess that, sorry.
I was just going to say, Jesus did not oppose the institution of slavery, either did Paul. Jesus, but that shouldn't seem weird. Nobody opposed the institution of slavery. I mean, we have authors who are slaves. They don't oppose the institution of slavery. It's just the way things are. It's just, and so I don't know that it occurred to much of anybody. I mean, slaves didn't want to be enslaved, and slaves could be set free, of course. I mean, an owner could set free somebody that they thought well of, or that they appreciated, or that they were paid off, and so it was a fluid institution, but it definitely was slavery. and there were some nasty things that happened.
There
was also, though, it turns out, but it turns out that in many ways in the ancient world, in many times and places, it was better to be a slave than to be a poor free person. Because the slave, at least, the master has a reason for feeding the slave to make sure that they're fed enough and healthy, because this is their hired labor. And if the person dies, they've lost an asset. The impoverished person doesn't have any backup plan. And so they're often seen as worse off than slaves.
Interesting. I guess the final thing I'd like to say is, was this whole Matthew 5 with Jesus to fulfill the law and the prophets, was this just like a used verse or passage to justify transatlantic slave trade? I mean, we know that like the Southern slave owners in America, for example, would use Bible verses sometimes to like, use their, slavery's thumbs up,
I don't know about Matthew 5 during the slave trade. It'd be worth finding out. But Matthew 5 itself is a complicated passage. It's not so. But you're not asking what it really means. You're asking how was it used.
Right,
and
right.
I don't know how it was used during the slave trade. It doesn't ring a bell as being the most common thing, though, because you have other things that would be more appropriate. The one that was used a lot, for example, was the curse of Ham. In the Old Testament, where in the story of Noah's three sons, who one of whom, Ham, saw Noah naked when he was stone drunk, and Noah realized that he'd been shamed in front of his son, and he cursed his son Canaan. And in the 19th century, as they developed race theories, anthropologists developed race theories that you have these races, and some have some qualities, some have other. The thought came to be that the what they called at the time the Negroid race came from Ham, and that since that race was cursed, that meant that white folk were justified in enslaving black folk. And so that was a very common thing. But Matthew 5, I'm not aware of, but it just might be my ignorance.
Well, thank you, Anthony, for those questions so much. Another donor says, I have a special request. Dr. Ehrman, please blink twice if you're secretly a mythicist. Would you like to comment? Look, his eyes opened up even more.
I'm going to get some toothpicks. No, I think the mythicists are completely wrong. And and I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. Does everybody know what a mythicist is on your program?
Yeah, everyone. Yeah, pretty much.
So, look, you're just doing yourself a disservice, because people who are not mythicists are laughing at you. You're ignoring historical evidence in order to assert a point. And you might think it's great, but it's like, look, if you're a big fan of Fox News or of MSNBC, you think it's great. But anybody who's not, who listens to this, says this is just crazy. And so, look, I'm a fan of MSNBC, but I'm a liberal, but the evidence is so overwhelming that I'm just like, why not argue something that is going to make a difference instead of like trying? So I know why people do it. They like to get a name from themselves, or they like to get a book published, or they like having a following, and then it's cool to say Jesus never existed, but it's just bollocks, to quote my English wife.
Could we, and by any chance, before we leave this one to the next question, is it possible to say that some of the academic mythicists aren't on the same playing field as some of the guys who are, let's say, coming up with really, really, really out there theories that don't even go into the vein of academia at all? Like, for example, Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Robert McNair Price. Would they be, you don't equate them to Holocaust deniers the same way you would someone else, right?
Not generally.
Because, I mean, those guys, yeah.
They know a lot, but they're completely wrong on this. Have you seen my debate with Robert Price?
Yes.
So,
yes.
I mean, I just think they're completely wrong. And Carrier, Carrier's a smart enough fellow, but I think he does himself a disservice. He knows a lot. He's published, he's published, an article or two in a peer-reviewed journal. He brags about how many things he publishes in peer-reviewed journals, but I mean, it's not like a big deal. This is what scholars do. But there's nobody. There is no professor of New Testament in the world that I know of in an accredited university, and there are thousands of people like this, who's a mythicist. I don't know. Do you know of one? I don't know of one.
I am not aware.
And that's not an accident. And it's not, they say, well, they're prejudiced against us. Well, they're prejudiced against you for the same reason that the biology department is prejudiced against somebody who doesn't believe in evolution but believes in Adam and Eve. They think you don't have any evidence. And so, but they get offended when I say that. I know they get offended, but I'm just telling you the reality is this is the problem. So why not like use your intelligence to it. I don't know what your goal. I don't know what the goal is. But because I've never really kind of asked them the goal. But if the goal is to help people realize that Christianity is not true, you're not going to get there by saying things that people are just going to think are silly.
I have to make a comment, and then we'll get to the next question. There's a group that thinks that all Paul's Gentiles are actually secretly lost Israelites, and so I'm like, and they go, well, this disproves Christianity. I'm like, you're never going to convince, first of all, with Greek and linguistics and experts, they all disagree with you. But number two is, you think this is going to convince them? Anyway, there's so much more, Dr. Ehrman, that I can't even begin. We don't have the time. And if we thought we did, we'd be practicing cognitive dissonance. So
we discovered we had it. Yeah, right.
Yes, sir. Textual criticism. This is, how do I say this? Apologist. We're going to be talking about this. So before I get into the key stuff, I'd like to cover, I just want to make sure our viewers get a very brief introduction to some of the basics of textual criticism, since a few of these topics are going to come up during our discussion. My friend Stephen Nelson, you're the man, has put together some illustrations for all of the stuff we're going to be going over, and thanks for the illustrations, man. I'm going to pull up one that he made to start the conversation off, which is an illustration of B.H. Streeter's theory of local text. And so let me pull this up real quick. I apologize.
Do your listeners know what you're talking about?
I don't think half of them will. Let me do this.
Just wondered.
So let me read this and then get your thoughts. Can you explain in broad terms what all this represents in terms text types and the transmission of the New Testament? And can you also explain what the coherence-based genealogical method is? I know you're gonna love this. No, I'm not
gonna explain that. I'm telling you.
Well, I'm gonna try. I'm just trying. And how it's changing the way textual critics conceive of text types and the role they play in reconstructed text. And by the way, you're going to hate me. Ready? Try to do it in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, right, okay. So I want you to explain quantum physics in 5 minutes or less, please, and make it simple so everybody can understand. Okay, don't use any complicated language here.
I know, right?
Okay. So is everybody seeing this chart?
I think so.
So B.H. Streeter was early 20th century, a major scholar of the Gospels, Brit. He is building on the theory developed most convincingly by Westcott and Hort, who were two Cambridge scholars in the 1880s, who published their work in the 1880s. The logic of this chart is that you have different forms of the New Testament in circulation in different parts of the Christian world in the early centuries. By different forms of the New Testament, I mean that scribes are copying the New Testament in Alexandria, Egypt, in North Africa, in the city of Caesarea. They're different scribes in different places are copying the text. And in every place, scribes are making mistakes, and they're sometimes changing things on purpose. The changes made in one place tend to stay in that place because that's where their successor scribes are copying them. And so a certain form of the text that's worded in a certain way. So you take John chapter 1, there'll be differences in the way it's worded in Alexandria and in Caesarea and in Antioch in Italy, depending on the changes that scribes have made and then reproduced in that locale. The argument of Streeter is that you can isolate these various local texts, and that over time, as Christianity grew and spread, the textual traditions of one place came to affect the textual traditions of other places, until by the end of the 4th century, you end up with a text that was kind of an amalgamated text of these various locations, that is not particularly close to what the original looked like, because it's an amalgamation of local texts in various places that have all been smashed together into one text that there is being seen as improved, but in fact has all sorts of changes in it because of where it came from. That's called the Byzantine text. That became the text of the Greek New Testament throughout the Middle Ages, and it is the form of the text that then was used as the basis for the King James translation. So that the King James translation is based on a form of the text that is a late and inferior form of the text. To find out what the text looked like in the earlier centuries before the Byzantine text, you have to isolate the Alexandrian text and the Caesarean text and so forth and so on.
So a quick question on that is, do we have, or I might be wrong about this, we don't have Jerome's Vulgate, do we? I think only later copies that are corrupt, correct?
We don't have the original thing that Jerome did, and Jerome actually didn't do the entire the Vulgate. He did the Gospels, and so we don't have the originals of the Greek New Testament, or the originals of the Vulgate, or the originals of versions done in Syriac or Coptic or Armenian, or none of these languages. So what we have in all of them are copies that have been made that have been changed either by mistake, by accident, or on purpose. And the trick of textual criticism is to figure out, among all these manuscripts, which reading of this verse is the one that was originally written. John 1:18. What did it originally say when the author wrote it, and how was it changed, and why was it changed? That's what textual critics do. And Streeter was an old style textual critic who was very good at what he did.
He's not genealogical based.
He is genealogically based, but he's not. He's not the coherence-based genealogical method. No, he's genealogical. The whole thing is a genealogy because you're drawing a family tree.
Okay, got it.
So you're drawing a genealogy, and so that exactly is what he's doing, but that's not what the genealogical-based coherence. I mean, yeah.